My mother screamed for me to get out of her house physically, throwing my coat out the front door while my sister and her husband laughed at my supposed poverty. They thought they had finally broken me. They thought I would be homeless and begging for their help by morning. But as I walked away from their insults, leaving behind their toxic delusions, they had no idea that the very next day, I would be stepping into a $40 million mansion. A mansion they never knew I owned, and a property that would soon become the ultimate trap for their boundless greed. My name is Zariah, and at 32 years old, I am still healing from the deep emotional wounds my family inflicted on me over a lifetime. As the hidden chief executive officer of a highly exclusive luxury real estate firm, I had quietly escaped their toxic obsession with status and built an empire they knew nothing about. I had maintained occasional contact simply out of a misplaced sense of duty. But last Sunday changed everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth and tried to use you for their own gain. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, our household was a carefully directed stage play, and my mother Clarice was the lead actress and director. She was the head of the church choir, a woman who valued the appearance of success and high social standing far more than actual integrity or love. To outsiders, we were the perfect God-fearing family. But inside our impeccably decorated colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. I was considered the family disappointment because I chose a path of quiet, grueling work rather than loud, flashy posturing. I built my career from the ground up, dealing with high-net-worth individuals and curating properties for billionaires. But to my family, I was just a struggling girl who moved furniture around for a living. My younger sister Nia was the golden child. She was everything my mother valued. Materialistic, loud, constantly flexing designer bags on social media, and married to a man who looked perfect on paper. Her husband Darius called himself a hedge fund manager. He wore flashy tailored suits, drove a leased luxury car, and spoke in a constant stream of financial buzzwords that impressed the church congregation, but always sounded incredibly hollow to anyone who actually understood money. The immediate conflict that shattered our family forever began right after a grueling 3-hour Sunday church service. We were all gathered around my mother's polished mahogany dining table for our traditional Sunday dinner. The smell of roasted chicken, collard greens, and sweet potato pie filled the room, giving the false illusion of a warm family gathering. But the tension in the room was already thick. Darius had been dominating the conversation for 20 minutes, loudly bragging about a new wealth management fund he was launching. When Darius first brought up the gala, he spent an agonizing amount of time describing the floral centerpieces, the imported champagne he planned to serve, and the local politicians he intended to invite. He painted a picture of absolute luxury, a lifestyle he believed was his ultimate birthright. Nia sat next to him, nodding along like a dutiful disciple, occasionally interrupting to mention what designer gown she planned to purchase for the occasion. They were completely intoxicated by their own delusions of grandeur. I sat there quietly pushing a piece of sweet potato pie around my plate, calculating the obvious financial holes in his story. I worked with genuine billionaires daily. I knew exactly how real wealth operated. Real wealth was silent, calculated, and legally secure. Darius was loud, desperate, and sweating through his expensive cologne. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his iced tea with a deeply arrogant smirk on his face. He announced to the table that he needed to host a massive, highly exclusive investor gala to officially launch his fund and secure millions in capital. But then came the catch. He sighed dramatically, adjusting his tacky gold watch. He claimed that because he was making such massive market moves, all of his liquid assets were temporarily tied up in offshore accounts and complex investment portfolios. He needed a massive cash deposit right away to secure a suitable venue for this elite gala, and he simply could not access his own millions. That was when my mother, Clarice, reached into her leather church tote bag. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and pushed them aggressively across the table until they rested right next to my dinner plate. I looked down at the bold print on the first page. It was a legally binding collateral agreement for a high-interest commercial loan. Clarice looked at me with cold, demanding eyes. She told me that family steps up when a loved one is on the verge of greatness. She demanded that I sign the papers using my small two-bedroom condo as the sole collateral to secure a high-risk short-term loan so Darius could rent his luxury party venue. She was asking me to risk the only roof over my head, the only asset they thought I had, to fund her son-in-law's networking party. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I simply looked at the paperwork, then looked at Darius. I asked him calmly why a successful hedge fund manager could not secure a standard business line of credit from a reputable bank. I asked him why his corporate partners were not fronting the operational costs for a simple fund launch. Darius scoffed, rolling his eyes as if I were a foolish child asking an absurd question. Before he could spin another lie, my sister Nia immediately went on the attack. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand onto the table, making the fine crystal silverware rattle against the plates. "You are just bitter, Zariah." Nia snapped, her voice dripping with venom and superiority. "You are just jealous because Darius is an elite wealth manager who is actually doing something important with his life. Meanwhile, you are 32, completely single, and hauling sofas for rich white folks across town. You do not understand high-level finance. You should be honored that Darius even trusts you enough to let you be a small part of his success story." I looked at my sister, marveling at her absolute delusion. She honestly believed that her husband was a titan of Wall Street, and she genuinely viewed me as the pathetic sibling who needed their charity. I slowly pushed the legal document away from my plate, sliding it back toward the center of the table. I stated very clearly that I would never put my home at risk for a party, and I told Darius that if his fund was as successful as he claimed, he could wait a few weeks for his imaginary offshore accounts to clear. My calm refusal was the spark that ignited a massive explosion. Clarice slammed both of her hands on the table and stood up. The pious, smiling church choir director vanished, replaced by a vicious, controlling woman who could not stand being defied by the daughter she viewed as inferior. She decided to weaponize the past, bringing up every perceived debt she believed I owed her. "How dare you sit at my table and disrespect your brother-in-law?" Clarice shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room. I paid over $70,000 for Nia's tuition at Spelman College so she could circulate with the right people and find a high-value man. And she did exactly what I asked. What have you done? I let you live in this very house rent-free for 2 solid months after you finished your little community college courses. You owe this family everything you have. We protect our own. Your credit score and your pathetic little apartment are not worth more than Darius's future. Sign the papers, Zariah." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She was actually equating 2 months of living in my childhood bedroom nearly a decade ago to me risking total financial ruin for a man I knew was a complete fraud. She had willingly paid a fortune for Nia to get a degree she never used, simply to land a flashy husband, but she demanded that I risk my home for a man who could not even produce a clean bank statement. I placed my cloth napkin on the table and stood up. I looked down at the three of them. A mother obsessed with image, a sister blinded by greed, and a brother-in-law drowning in his own lies. I told them absolutely not. And I told them they were out of their minds if they thought I would sign my life away for a man who was clearly broke. Enraged by my absolute defiance, Clarice lost whatever tiny amount of composure she had left. "Get out of my house!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. Her face was flushed red and the veins in her neck were bulging. She marched away from the dining table, walked straight into the hallway and grabbed my beige trench coat off the wooden rack. She opened the heavy oak front door and physically threw my coat out onto the concrete porch. "If you will not support the vision of this family, then you are no longer a part of this family," she yelled into the quiet suburban street. "Get out and do not ever come back until you are ready to apologize and beg for our forgiveness." Darius leaned back in his chair, picking his teeth with a smug, victorious look on his face. "Enjoy being broken alone, Zariah," he sneered from the dining room. "When my fund clears $10 million next month, do not come crawling to my wife begging for a handout." I did not cry. I did not scream back. The emotional manipulation that used to paralyze me when I was younger simply did not work anymore. I walked out the front door with my head held high. I bent down, picked up my coat, and brushed the dirt off the fabric. I did not look back at the house that had always felt like an emotional prison. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I was not calling a cheap cab to take me back to my small condo. I was texting my private security team and my personal driver to come pick me up. They celebrated my departure inside, laughing and patting each other on the back, completely convinced that they had just punished the weak link of the family. They thought I was walking away into a life of poverty and regret. But as I watched my sleek black armored SUV pull up to the curb, I felt nothing but absolute freedom. They had no idea that their cruel ejection was the greatest favor they could have ever done for me. And they certainly had no idea that the very next morning, while they were busy scheming to find money they did not actually have, I would be stepping into my brand new $40 million estate. The board was beautifully set. The trap was waiting, and my arrogant family was about to walk right into it. The morning air was crisp as my private driver navigated the winding tree-lined streets of Buckhead. The transition from the chaotic, emotionally draining atmosphere of my mother's dining room to the silent, absolute luxury of my actual life was always a stark contrast. I sat in the back of the sleek black Maybach, sipping a freshly pressed green juice, reviewing the daily briefings on my secure tablet. There were no frantic phone calls begging for loans. There were no desperate schemes to secure a venue. There was only the quiet hum of a perfectly oiled multi-million-dollar empire running exactly as I had designed it. The Maybach slowed as we approached a massive set of imposing wrought iron gates. The security cameras scanned the vehicle, recognizing the encrypted signature of my car, and the gates parted seamlessly. We glided up the long, sweeping driveway paved with imported Italian cobblestone. At the end of the drive stood my latest acquisition. It was a breathtaking $40 million ultra-modern mansion, a masterpiece of glass steel and architectural brilliance that sat on 8 acres of prime Atlanta real estate. My driver opened the door, and I stepped out onto the pristine driveway. I was wearing a tailored charcoal gray power suit and a pair of Christian Louboutin heels that clicked sharply against the stone. I took a deep breath, letting the magnitude of the property wash over me. My family genuinely believed I was waking up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, stressing over how to pay my electric bill. They thought the coat my mother threw on the porch was the only valuable thing I owned. They had no idea that I held the keys to the most exclusive properties in the entire state of Georgia. I walked through the massive double doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The ceiling soared 30 feet high, bathing the space in natural light. My lead assistant, Julian, was already waiting for me with a clipboard and a flawless cup of espresso. Julian was impeccably dressed, highly efficient, and fiercely loyal. He handed me the espresso and immediately began walking me through the morning itinerary. "We have a slight issue with the new security contractor for this property," Julian said, his tone perfectly neutral. "He is waiting for you in the West Wing terrace. He insists the current camera placements are adequate, but they do not meet our standard protocols." I did not say a word. I simply handed Julian my empty espresso cup and walked briskly toward the West Wing. I found the contractor standing near the edge of the infinity pool, arguing with one of my junior property managers. The contractor was a burly man who looked like he was used to intimidating people into agreeing with him. "What exactly is the problem here?" I asked, my voice cutting through his loud complaints. The contractor turned around, looking me up and down. He clearly saw a young 32-year-old woman and immediately assumed I was just a clueless assistant or an overly demanding decorator. "Listen, sweetheart," he said with a condescending chuckle. "I have been installing high-end security systems for 20 years. You do not need a camera covering the blind spot behind those hedges. It is overkill. Trust me, do not worry your pretty little head about it. Nobody is scaling a 12-foot retaining wall to get into this place." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of mediocre men never ceased to amaze me. I did not raise my voice, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "My clients are tech billionaires, international dignitaries, and A-list celebrities," I said, stepping closer to him so he could fully understand the gravity of his mistake. "They pay me for absolute airtight perfection." That blind spot creates a 72-second window where an intruder could bypass the perimeter sensors before hitting the secondary alarm. That is unacceptable. Furthermore, you just called the chief executive officer of this company, sweetheart. The color instantly drained from his face as he realized exactly who he was talking to. I turned to Julian, who was standing quietly holding the clipboard. Fire him, I instructed, without breaking eye contact with the contractor. Cancel his company's contract across all 5 of our active development sites in the city. Have his team pack up their equipment and leave my property within the next 15 minutes. Call the tactical firm we used for the estate in Miami and fly them in to finish this job correctly. Yes, Soraya, Julian replied smoothly, immediately typing the orders into his tablet. The contractor tried to apologize, stammering and backpedaling, but I was already walking away. I had zero tolerance for incompetence and absolutely no time for disrespect. I built Apex Elite Estates from nothing, operating entirely under a blind trust to protect my identity from the public and, more importantly, from the greedy hands of my own family. My name was never on the public deeds. My signature was hidden behind layers of corporate shell companies and high-powered legal representation. To the world, Apex was a faceless corporate entity that catered to the ultra-wealthy. Only a very select group of people knew that a black woman from a toxic household in the suburbs was pulling every single string. Julian caught up with me as we entered the main gallery of the mansion. A team of white-gloved art handlers was carefully hoisting a massive $2 million abstract sculpture onto a reinforced marble pedestal. The curator of the gallery stood by nervously holding a stack of authenticity documents. The lighting needs to be adjusted by 2 degrees to highlight the bronze texturing, I told the curator as I walked past the sculpture. It looks flat. Fix the lighting and I will sign off on the installation. The curator scrambled to direct his team, adjusting the overhead spotlights until the sculpture completely came to life, reflecting the morning sun in brilliant flashes of gold and bronze. I took the golden pen Julian offered me and casually signed my name on the $2 million invoice. It was just another standard Tuesday morning in my world. Just as I handed the clipboard back to Julian, my personal cell phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a sharp, distinct buzz that I only used for one specific contact group. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. It was the family group chat. I rarely ever received notifications from them, unless it was a holiday, a demand for money, or an opportunity for them to brag. Today, it was clearly the latter. I opened the message. Naya had sent a mass text to the entire extended family, including aunts, uncles, and cousins who lived out of state. Attached to the text was a high-resolution photo of her wrist resting on the steering wheel of her leased luxury SUV. Wrapped around her wrist was a massive, gaudily designed diamond bracelet. It looked heavy, ostentatious, and entirely too flashy to be tasteful. The caption below this photo read, "God is so good. Darius is making massive moves. He just successfully secured a $40 million estate in Buckhead for his elite investor gala next weekend. We are expecting the mayor and several state senators. Sorry you will not be on the guest list, Zoraya. Maybe you can come by tomorrow and help the catering staff decorate the tables. Next year, if you work hard, maybe you can buy a ticket." I read the message twice. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection that used to plague my childhood. Instead, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. The absolute delusion was almost poetic. They were celebrating a victory they had not actually won, wearing jewelry they likely bought on credit, and using my perceived poverty to inflate their own fragile egos. Nia wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to sit in my tiny condo and cry over being excluded from her glamorous life. She honestly believed that her husband, a man who just yesterday tried to force me to co-sign a loan with my own home, was suddenly doing multi-million-dollar deals with the city's elite. I did not reply to the group chat. I simply locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. Let them have their moment of manufactured glory. Let them boast to the church congregation and post their fake achievements on social media. The higher they climbed on their ladder of lies, the more devastating the fall was going to be. I turned my attention back to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the infinity pool, mentally reviewing the staging plans for the master suite. But before I could take another step, my secure corporate iPad resting on the marble kitchen island emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. It was not a standard email notification. It was an urgent, red-flagged alert from the executive tier of my elite leasing department. Julian immediately walked over, his brow furrowed in concern. He tapped the screen and opened the encrypted file. "That is an expedited priority application for a short-term high-risk rental," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. The applicant requested a 24-hour turnaround for approval. I walked over to the island and looked down at the glowing screen. The application was submitted through a shady third-party shell company, a common tactic used by people trying to hide their true financial status or conceal their identity from high-end landlords. But my leasing department required a personal guarantor for any property valued over $10 million, no exceptions. I scrolled down past the corporate jargon, past the requested dates, and past the absurdly demanding list of catering requirements. My eyes landed on the final page of the document. Right there, signed in digital ink, was the name of the personal guarantor. Darius. I stared at the name, my pulse remaining entirely steady, though a thrilling rush of absolute clarity washed over me. I looked at the property address listed at the very top of the application. I did not have to read it twice. The requested venue, the $40 million estate that Darius had supposedly just secured, the crown jewel of Buckhead that Nia was currently bragging about to our entire extended family, was the exact same house I was currently standing inside. They had no idea that the faceless corporate landlord they were desperately trying to impress was the same woman they had just thrown out into the street. The trap was not just set. They had walked directly into it, handed me the keys, and locked the door behind them. I looked up at Julian, my cold smile returning. "Tell legal to send this application straight to my private office," I said softly. "It is time to review my brother-in-law's finances." Less than an hour later, Elias walked through the grand double doors of my private home office. Elias was not just a corporate attorney. He was a legal shark who thrived in the deep, dangerous waters of high-stakes real estate and corporate acquisitions. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his briefcase gripped firmly in his hand, and his expression set in its usual state of calculated intensity. We had worked together for 5 years, building apex elite estates from a promising startup into an absolute juggernaut. He knew my history. He knew about the toxic family dynamics I had left behind, and he understood exactly why I required absolute anonymity in my business dealings. "Take a seat," I said, gesturing toward the sleek leather chair positioned across from my massive glass desk. "We have a rather amusing situation on our hands today." Elias sat down, opening his briefcase and pulling out his secure laptop. "Julian sent me the priority application file on his way out," Elias said, typing his encryption password with rapid, precise keystrokes. "I must admit I was highly entertained on the drive over here. Your brother-in-law has an astonishing level of unearned confidence." "Pull it up on the main monitor," I instructed, leaning back in my chair and steepling my fingers. "Let us see exactly how Darius plans to pay for this little fantasy of his." Elias tapped a key and the digital application illuminated the large flat screen mounted on the wall. I scanned the first few pages of the document. Darius had not applied under his own name, of course. That would be entirely too straightforward for a man who lived his life wrapped in layers of deceit. Instead, the application was filed under a newly registered limited liability company called Vanguard Pinnacle Holdings. The name alone was a hilarious cliché, the kind of flashy, meaningless corporate title a con artist creates to sound important to people who do not know any better. "He is using a third-party shell company to hide his identity from the landlord," Elias explained, a mocking smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "He set this company up barely 3 weeks ago. He is using a registered agent service to mask the primary ownership, but he made a rookie mistake. He listed himself as the sole personal guarantor on the liability waiver. He is completely unaware that the landlord he is desperately trying to fool is actually sitting right across from me." I shook my head, marveling at the pure, unadulterated arrogance of the man. Just yesterday, he was sitting at my mother's dining room table demanding that I sign over the deed to my modest two-bedroom condo so he could secure a loan. When I refused, he mocked me, telling me to enjoy my supposed poverty. Now, less than 24 hours later, he was submitting legally binding financial documents to my own corporation, begging to rent my property so he could impress a crowd of strangers. He is trying to throw a massive investor gala to launch a new wealth management fund, I explained to Elias, keeping my voice calm and analytical. He claims he has millions of dollars tied up in offshore accounts, which is why he desperately needed cash yesterday. He needs this house to create the illusion of extreme wealth. He thinks if he can get high net worth individuals into this mansion, they will be blinded by the marble floors and the infinity pool, and they will hand him their money without doing their due diligence. Elias laughed, a sharp, cynical sound that echoed in the quiet office. It is a classic fake it until you make it scheme, but he is playing way out of his league. Our leasing requirements are incredibly strict. To secure the specific property for a one-night corporate event, the applicant must provide a non-refundable deposit of $150,000 plus a $200,000 security hold for potential damages. We require liquid assets. We do not take promises, and we certainly do not take imaginary offshore accounts. That is exactly what confused me, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the cool glass of my desk. If Darius is broke enough to beg me for a loan against my condo on a Sunday afternoon, how did he suddenly produce $150,000 in liquid cash by Monday morning? Elias stopped smiling. His demeanor instantly shifted from amused to strictly professional. He clicked a few buttons on his laptop, opening the financial verification attachments Darius had provided with the application. That is where things get incredibly disturbing, Zariah. I flagged a massive discrepancy in his proof of assets. Elias enlarged a bank statement on the screen. The document showed a recent wire transfer into the Vanguard Pinnacle Holdings business account. The amount was exactly $200,000. The funds were available and fully cleared. He did not use his own money, Elias stated firmly, pointing to the origin of the wire transfer. This cash did not come from a legitimate commercial bank. It did not come from an investment portfolio. It came from a private equity lender called Blackwood Financial. They are a shadow lender. They operate on the fringes of the law, providing high-interest, predatory bridge loans to people who are too financially compromised to walk into a traditional bank. My eyes narrowed as I stared at the name of the predatory lending firm. Why would a shadow lender give a man with terrible credit a $200,000 unsecured loan? They would not, Elias replied quietly. Shadow lenders are ruthless, but they are not stupid. They never hand out that kind of cash without an ironclad guarantee. They require hard, tangible collateral, something they can seize and liquidate immediately if the borrower defaults. Usually, it is commercial real estate or a primary residence with substantial equity. I felt a sudden icy chill crawl up my spine. My mind raced backward to yesterday afternoon. My mother pushing the loan documents across the table. Her desperate need to protect Darius. Her furious declaration that family must sacrifice everything for his success. Show me the collateral agreement, I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Show me exactly what Darius used to secure that loan. Elias typed another command, bringing up a scanned copy of the loan origination document Darius had foolishly included to prove the legitimacy of the wire transfer. The document was dense with legal jargon outlining an exorbitant interest rate and a terrifyingly short repayment window. But my eyes bypassed the numbers and went straight to the section labeled Securing Asset. Right there, typed clearly in bold black ink, was an address. It was not a commercial building. It was not a piece of vacant land. It was a residential address located in a quiet, manicured suburb of Atlanta. It was a 4-bedroom colonial house with a pale blue bedroom on the second floor. It was my mother's house. My blood ran completely cold. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I stared at the screen, unable to blink. Darius had not just borrowed money. He had pledged the deed to my mother's fully paid-off home as collateral to a ruthless, predatory lender. Scroll down to the signature page. I ordered, my voice tight with a mixture of absolute horror and boiling rage. Elias scrolled down. At the bottom of the document, resting on the line designated for the property owner, was a signature. It read Clarice Washington. I stared at the cursive letters. To an untrained eye, it looked legitimate. But I was her daughter. I had spent 18 years living under her roof. I had seen her sign thousands of report cards, permission slips, and church choir schedules. I knew the aggressive sharp angle she always used when crossing the letter T. I knew the elaborate looping flourish she added to the capital C. The signature on the screen had neither of those distinct characteristics. The strokes were hesitant, slightly shaky, and entirely too perfectly rounded. It was a glaring, undeniable forgery. "That is not my mother's handwriting," I said, the words falling from my lips like heavy stones. "He forged her signature." Elias exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "If that is true, then your brother-in-law has just crossed the line from a pathetic wannabe into a full-blown federal criminal. He committed felony, wire fraud, bank fraud, and forgery. He illegally leveraged a property he does not own to secure a massive cash loan from a lender that will absolutely destroy that house the second he misses a payment." The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me in waves. Yesterday, my mother had physically thrown me out of her house, screaming that I was useless because I refused to risk my tiny condo for him. She had defended Darius with her entire chest, calling him the future of the family. She was completely, blissfully blind to the fact that while she was busy attacking me to protect him, he had already quietly signed her home away to the wolves. "He is literally betting his mother-in-law's home just to throw a party," I whispered, staring at the forged signature on the massive screen. "He is risking the roof over her head, the house she worked her entire life to pay off, just to rent my mansion for one night so he can pretend to be a billionaire. And if this gala fails," Elias added grimly, "if he does not secure the millions in investor capital he is banking on, he will not be able to repay Blackwood Financial. They will file a lien against the property immediately. They will foreclose on your mother's house and she will be out on the street with absolutely nothing." The irony was suffocating. Clarice had cast me out into the cold thinking she was securing her golden child's future. Instead, she had handed the keys to her own destruction directly to the devil. She thought she was building a legacy, but she was actually financing a catastrophic illusion. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the pristine grounds of the $40 million estate I owned, free and clear. I thought about Nia, currently sending out text messages, bragging about this house, completely unaware that the diamonds on her wrist were bought with the stolen equity of her mother's home. I thought about Darius, sitting somewhere right now, grinning in a cheap suit, convinced he had outsmarted the entire world. They wanted to play high-stakes games with real estate. They wanted to destroy me to elevate themselves. But they had absolutely no idea that they were playing at a table where I owned the house, I dealt the cards, and I controlled the entire board. "Approve the application," I said, turning back to face Elias. My voice was no longer tight. It was completely calm, devoid of any hesitation or mercy. Elias raised an eyebrow, a predatory glint flashing in his eyes. "Are you entirely sure about that? We are knowingly allowing a fraudster to rent the property." "I am absolutely sure," I replied, walking back to my desk. "Approve his application. Take the $150,000 he stole from my mother's equity and lock it into our non-refundable corporate escrow account. Let him have his venue. Let him invite the mayor, the state senators, and every wealthy member of my mother's church congregation. Let them all put on their expensive gowns and their leased jewelry and walk through my front doors." Elias began typing rapidly, initiating the approval process. "And what about the liability waiver? Draft a customized addendum to the standard contract," I instructed, placing my hands flat on the glass desk. "Insert a strict legally binding clause stating that any fraudulent financial activity, misrepresentation of identity, or illegal business practices conducted on the premises will result in immediate termination of the lease, forced eviction by private security, and total forfeiture of all deposits and assets associated with the event." Bury it deep in the legal terminology so his arrogant eyes glaze right over it. "Consider it done," Elias said, a dark smile spreading across his face. "He is desperate. He will sign anything you put in front of him without reading a single word. Exactly, I said softly, looking back at the forged signature glowing on the wall. Darius wanted a stage to show the world who he really is. I am going to give him the most expensive, well-lit stage in the entire city of Atlanta. And when the curtain finally falls, I am going to make sure he loses absolutely everything. Elias did not waste another second. He opened a secure drafting window on his laptop and began typing the addendum. I watched as his fingers flew across the keyboard, constructing a legal bear trap hidden beneath paragraphs of standard commercial real estate jargon. The clause was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. It explicitly stated that any misrepresentation of identity, use of fraudulent funds, or operation of illegal financial schemes on the premises would grant the landlord the absolute right to terminate the lease immediately, without notice. Furthermore, it authorized private security to enact an immediate physical eviction and allowed for the total seizure of all event assets, including catering decor and electronic equipment, to cover the breach of contract. He finished typing and reviewed the text. It was flawless. Elias uploaded the revised contract to the secure leasing portal and hit send. The document was instantly delivered to the email address Darius had set up for his fake shell company. Now we wait, Elias said, closing his laptop. A standard legal review of a document, this dense, should take his lawyer at least 2 days. If he even has a lawyer. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the carafe on my desk. He will not use a lawyer, I replied. He cannot afford one, and his ego will not allow him to admit he needs one. He is desperate to lock down this venue before his imaginary investors start asking questions. Less than 4 minutes later, Elias's laptop emitted a sharp, definitive ping. We both looked at the screen. A digital confirmation receipt had just materialized in the inbox. Darius had signed the contract. He had applied his digital signature to all 42 pages of the agreement in less time than it takes to make a cup of coffee. He had not read a single word of the addendum. He just signed his own execution order, Elias murmured, shaking his head in a mixture of disbelief and professional satisfaction. He is officially, legally bound to every single term. Elias packed up his briefcase, shook my hand, and left the office to initiate the background checks on the guest list Darius had submitted. I was left alone in the quiet luxury of my workspace, the digital copy of the signed contract glowing softly on my monitor. I had barely taken a sip of my water when my personal cell phone began ringing, vibrating harshly against the glass desk. I glanced at the caller identification. It was Aunt Vivian. Aunt Vivian was my mother's older sister and the undisputed queen of the church gossip mill. In the toxic ecosystem of our extended family, she played the role of the ultimate enabler and the primary flying monkey. Whenever my mother felt slighted, or whenever the family narrative needed to be violently enforced, Vivian was dispatched to do the dirty work. She was a woman who lived for drama, cloaking her cruelty in religious platitudes and fake concern. I let it ring 3 times before I calmly swiped the screen to answer. "Hello, Aunt Vivian," I said, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "Zariah," Vivian snapped, not bothering with any pleasantries. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with self-righteous indignation. "I have just spent the last hour on the phone with your mother. She is completely distraught. She is practically in tears because of your selfish, jealous behavior yesterday." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out the window at the manicured lawns of my estate. "Is she distraught?" I asked smoothly. "Or is she just angry that I refused to give up my home to fund a scam?" "Do not you dare use that tone with me," Vivian scolded, her volume increasing. "You are completely out of line. Your mother raised you. She put a roof over your head. And the one time she asks you to step up and support your family, you disrespect her and walk out. You are actively trying to sabotage your brother-in-law because you cannot stand to see someone else succeed. You are jeopardizing Darius's blessings, Araya. He is on the verge of bringing generational wealth into this family, and you are throwing a childish tantrum over a simple signature." "Generational wealth," I repeated, almost laughing at the absolute absurdity of the phrase. "Vivian Darius does not have generational wealth. He does not even have enough money to rent a building without begging for a cosigner. That is a temporary cash flow issue," Vivian countered quickly, reciting the exact lie my sister had undoubtedly fed her. His millions are tied up in offshore investments. It is high-level finance, something you clearly do not understand given your line of work. He is securing a $40 million estate for his gala next week. He has the mayor coming. He has state senators coming. He is operating at a level you could never even dream of reaching. And instead of being proud, you are being bitter. The entire church congregation is talking about your jealousy. It is an embarrassment to our family name. I listened to her rant, analyzing the layers of delusion. They were all so desperate to believe in the fantasy. They needed Darius to be a millionaire so they could feel superior by association. They were willing to overlook every red flag, every financial discrepancy, and every obvious lie just to maintain the illusion of status. So if I am such an embarrassment, why are you calling me? I asked quietly. If Darius is so wildly successful and my mother is so deeply offended by my presence, what is the purpose of this conversation? There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear Vivian taking a deep, dramatic breath, preparing to deliver the ultimate ultimatum. Your mother is a forgiving woman. Vivian began, her tone shifting from aggressive to fiercely patronizing. She does not want her family torn apart over your jealousy. She is willing to let you back into the family. She is willing to overlook your massive disrespect from Sunday dinner, but only if you are willing to humble yourself and prove that you actually support this family's success. I waited, saying absolutely nothing. Nia and Darius need extra staff for the gala next week. Vivian continued, her voice dripping with condescension. They have hired elite caterers and high-end security, but they need someone they can trust to handle the front entrance. Your mother said that if you are willing to work the gala as the coat check girl, she will accept it as a formal apology. A coat check girl. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer insult of the offer wash over me. My mother, the woman whose home was currently leveraged to a predatory shadow lender without her knowledge, wanted me to stand in the foyer of my own $40 million mansion and take the coats of the people Darius was trying to scam. She wanted to physically put me in a position of servitude to reinforce her twisted hierarchy. She wanted Nia to walk past me in her leased jewelry while I held the jackets of her fake investors. It was the ultimate power play, designed to break my spirit and force me to acknowledge their absolute superiority. It will build character. Zariah Vivian pushed, mistaking my silence for submission. It will show the church and the family that you know your place and that you are willing to help out when it matters. If you do this, your mother will let you come back to Sunday dinner. If you refuse, you are cut off permanently. Do not be stupid. Take the olive branch. I opened my eyes. I looked around my sprawling, silent office. I looked at the digital contract proving that I held the absolute legal authority to destroy Darius's entire life with a single phone call. I thought about the forged signature. I thought about the fake offshore accounts. I thought about the absolute devastation that was going to rain down on all of them the moment the lights went out at that party. I did not get angry. I did not yell at Aunt Vivian. I did not try to defend my career or explain my wealth. I simply let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Aunt Vivian, I said, my voice incredibly soft and perfectly steady. You are absolutely right. I should be there to support my family during such a momentous occasion. Vivian sighed loudly, clearly relieved that she had successfully bullied me into submission. Good. I'm glad you finally found some sense. Tell Mom I will accept her offer. I continued, my eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. Tell her I will be at the gala. Tell Nia and Darius they do not need to worry about a thing at the front door. I will make sure everyone's coats are taken care of. I hung up the phone before Vivian could say another word. I set the device down on my desk and stood up, walking back over to the expansive window. The trap was perfectly set. The legal documents were signed. The family had secured my attendance exactly where they wanted me. They thought they had backed me into a corner, forcing me to swallow my pride and submit to their delusional reality. They had no idea I was the one who built the corner. They had no idea I was the one who owned the room. And they certainly had no idea what was waiting for them when they handed me their coats. The following afternoon, I sat in the subterranean security control room of the Buckhead Mansion. The room was bathed in the soft blue glow of 24 high-definition surveillance monitors. It looked more like an intelligence hub than a residential security office. From this hidden vantage point, I had eyes and ears on every square inch of the $40 million estate. My smart network tracked movement-isolated audio and recorded everything. Julian, my lead assistant and acting property manager, stood in the grand foyer waiting for our anticipated guests. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and an expression of professional neutrality. I had given him specific non-negotiable instructions. He was to treat them like any high-net-worth client, accommodate their walk-through requests with a smile, and under absolutely no circumstances reveal the true identity of the property owner. Right on schedule, a gleaming white rented Bentley pulled up to the outer security gates. I watched the exterior cameras as Darius argued briefly with the intercom guard. He aggressively tapped his watch, demanding immediate entry before the heavy iron gates finally swung open. They drove up the cobblestone driveway with agonizing slowness, clearly trying to soak in the magnitude of the estate they were attempting to hijack. When they stepped out of the vehicle, the contrast between their manufactured image and reality was almost comical. Nia stepped onto the pristine driveway wearing a bright pink designer dress that still had the faint crease of a fresh dry cleaning tag near the hem. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses, looking around like she had already conquered the world. Darius wore a flashy checkered suit that screamed new money, or in his case, absolutely no money at all. They walked through the double doors and were immediately greeted by Julian. "Welcome to the Apex Elite Estates prime Buckhead property," Julian said smoothly, offering them a polite nod. "I am Julian, the senior property manager. I will be conducting your orientation and walkthrough this afternoon." Darius puffed out his chest, looking around the soaring 30-foot ceilings of the grand foyer. "It is adequate," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the massive space. "I have seen better layouts in Dubai, but this will do for a simple networking event. Just make sure the catering staff uses the side entrance. I do not want the help mingling with my investors before the presentations begin." Julian simply smiled. "Of course, sir, right this way." As Julian led them through the main gallery and into the formal living room, Naya began her performance. She trailed her fingers over the custom Italian leather sofas and marble countertops, turning her nose up in a display of exaggerated distaste. She was trying to act like a woman accustomed to this level of luxury, but her overly critical remarks only exposed her deep insecurity. "The owner clearly has no taste whatsoever," Nia announced loudly, gesturing toward a priceless antique Persian rug. "Who uses this much beige in a modern build? It feels incredibly sterile. I bet the owner is just some old lonely woman with too much money and zero sense of style. She probably sits in this giant house all by herself, hoarding her wealth because she has absolutely nobody to share it with." I sat alone in the control room, sipping my iced coffee, watching her through camera 4. Her desperate need to put others down to elevate herself was a trait she had inherited directly from our mother. Darius chuckled, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Do not worry, baby," he said, kissing her cheek. "Once my fund crosses the $100 million mark, we will buy a place twice this size and let you decorate it properly. We will not have to rent from these faceless corporate entities anymore." Nia sighed dramatically, leaning into him. "I just cannot help but think about Zaraya when I see places like this. Can you imagine her trying to survive in a house this big? She could never even afford to clean these floors, let alone live here. It is honestly sad how different our paths turned out. Mom always said Zaraya lacked vision. I guess she was right. I just hope she does not embarrass us tomorrow night when she is taking the coats." Julian guided them past the living room and into the catering kitchen, politely ignoring their arrogant commentary. He pointed out the appliances and staging areas required for their event staff. He handed Darius a digital tablet containing floor plans, maintaining professional composure, even as Naya loudly complained about the marble backsplash. I watched them laugh together on the monitor. It was fascinating to witness their lack of self-awareness. They were standing inside my house, insulting my taste and mocking my financial status, all while their own financial house of cards was actively burning to the ground. While Julian was explaining the logistics of the service elevators to Nia, Darius began to look anxious. His phone had been vibrating relentlessly in his pocket since they walked through the front door. He kept pulling it out, glaring at the screen, and quickly shoving it back into his jacket. The slick, confident facade he had been wearing was starting to crack, revealing the terrified, desperate man hiding underneath. "Excuse me for a moment," Darius interrupted abruptly, waving his hand at Julian. "I need to take a highly confidential call from my partners in London. Give my wife the rest of the tour." Without waiting for an answer, Darius spun around and walked briskly out of the kitchen, heading back toward the quiet hallway near the library. I leaned forward in my leather chair. I tapped the touchscreen interface on my console, switching the main monitor to camera 7, which covered the library corridor. I dialed up the sensitivity on the hidden directional microphone embedded in the ceiling directly above him. Darius paced back and forth, his face pale and sweating. He looked over his shoulder to make sure he was alone before finally answering the call. His voice was no longer loud and arrogant. It was hushed, frantic, and trembling with fear. "I told you not to call me during business hours," Darius hissed into the phone. "I am handling it. I am standing inside the venue right now. Everything is perfectly set for tomorrow night." I could not hear the voice on the other end of the line, but I did not need to. The panic radiating from Darius told me exactly who he was talking to. It was not a partner in London. It was a debt collector. More specifically, it was likely someone representing Blackwood Financial, the shadow lender holding the forged deed to my mother's house. "Listen to me," Darius pleaded, running a hand over his face. "You have my collateral. You have the house. There is absolutely zero risk here. You just have to give me 48 hours. Do not pull the plug now. If you show up here or try to freeze my accounts, you will ruin the whole setup. The event is tomorrow night." He stopped pacing and pressed his forehead against the cool mahogany paneling of the hallway wall. He took a deep, ragged breath, trying to steady his voice. "I have the guest list locked in," Darius whispered into the receiver, his tone turning predatory. "It is a gold mine. I have state politicians, local celebrities, and the entire high-wealth registry from Clarice's megachurch. They trust Clarice blindly, which means they trust me by extension. The new flock of sheep from the church will bring in $5 million in liquid capital by tomorrow night. I already have the fake prospectus documents printed. As soon as the checks clear the holding account, you will get your cut. You will get everything I owe you plus the penalty fees. Just back off and let me fleece these people." My hand froze over the control console. The blood roared in my ears. I stared at the monitor, processing the sheer magnitude of what I had just heard. This was not just a man faking his wealth to look important. This was not a simple matter of renting a house he could not afford to throw a flashy party. Darius was orchestrating a massive financial crime right inside my home. He was running a Ponzi scheme. He was using his mother-in-law's prominent position in the church to target her wealthy friends. He planned to take their money, funnel it into his shell companies, pay off his predatory loans, and leave innocent people completely ruined. He hung up the phone, adjusting his tie and smoothing his suit jacket. He took a deep breath, pasting his fake smile back onto his face, before walking back to the kitchen to rejoin his wife. He thought he had bought enough time to execute his grand scheme. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. As soon as Darius disappeared from Monitor 7, I reached across the control console and pressed the secure intercom button, connecting me directly to Julian's earpiece. "Wrap up the tour immediately," I instructed, my voice flat and commanding. "Get them out of my house. Then come straight down to the control room. We have a massive situation." I did not wait for his confirmation. I grabbed my secure encrypted phone and dialed Elias. He answered on the first ring. "I need your entire forensic accounting team online right now," I told him, bypassing any greetings. "Darius is not just a broke man trying to fake his way into high society. He is actively running a Ponzi scheme, and he is planning to use my property tomorrow night to fleece $5 million from innocent people." Elias did not gasp or express shock. He was a professional predator, and I had just given him the scent of blood. "Give me 10 minutes to assemble the team," Elias said, his voice sharpening with adrenaline. "What is our primary target?" "Start with Vanguard Pinnacle Holdings." I instructed, my fingers flying across my own keyboard as I initiated a deep background protocol on my terminal. "But do not stop there. Pull every public record tax filing and corporate registration associated with his name over the last 5 years. Look for Delaware shell companies, offshore wire transfers, and unregistered securities. Follow the money. For the next 4 hours, the subterranean security room transformed into a high-tech war room. Julian returned, taking over the surveillance monitors to ensure Nia and Darius had completely vacated the premises, while I coordinated with Elias and his team of forensic accountants over a secure video link. What we uncovered was not just a pathetic attempt at financial fraud. It was a highly organized, deeply predatory, and absolutely sickening textbook Ponzi scheme. Darius had no offshore accounts. He had no legitimate investment portfolio. He possessed absolutely no licenses to trade securities or manage wealth. What he did have was an incredibly slick pitch deck and a direct pipeline to the most trusting demographic in the city. He was targeting the elderly, vulnerable, and wealthy members of my mother's mega church. The forensic team cracked the digital footprint of his previous shell companies. The financial pattern was painfully obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Darius would recruit a small handful of initial investors from the congregation, promising them absurdly high guaranteed returns on exclusive real estate development funds. He would then use the funds from newer investors to pay fake dividends to the original group. Those initial investors, thrilled by their fabricated profits, would then enthusiastically recruit their friends and family. It was a classic pyramid of lies, and it was entirely dependent on a constant influx of fresh cash to keep from collapsing. But the most disturbing part of the entire operation was my mother's role in it. Clarice was the head of the church choir and a highly respected figure on the pastoral council. She wielded massive social influence within that congregation. People trusted her implicitly. And because she was so desperate to show off her daughter's wealthy husband, she had become his ultimate unwitting accomplice. She was the one personally vouching for Darius. She was the one introducing him to wealthy widows, retired deacons, and older couples looking to secure their pensions. She was serving up her own friends on a silver platter, completely blinded by his flashy suits and his empty promises of generational wealth. I stared at the list of names Elias transmitted to my screen. These were not faceless corporate entities. I recognized these names. Mrs. Gable, the sweet older woman who used to give me hard candies during Sunday school, had already invested $50,000. Deacon Hayes, a man who had worked 40 years at the automotive plant to build his retirement savings, had transferred over $100,000 into Darius's fraudulent holding account just last month. These people were going to lose absolutely everything. The $5 million Darius was bragging about on the phone in my hallway was not corporate venture capital. It was the life savings, the pensions, and the safety nets of innocent, hardworking people. He was going to take their money tomorrow night, pay off the shadow lender holding the forged deed to my mother's house, and likely funnel the rest into untraceable crypto wallets before the entire scheme inevitably imploded. I leaned back in my chair, a cold, hardened resolve settling over me. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was no longer just about teaching my arrogant sister a lesson or proving my mother wrong. This was about protecting innocent people from a financial predator who was using my family name and my property to execute his crimes. I am shutting him down, I said to Elias over the video feed. I am not going to let a single dollar change hands tomorrow night. Elias nodded solemnly on the screen. If we simply cancel the lease and lock him out of the venue, he will just reschedule the gala somewhere else. He will find another way to pitch these people. To stop him permanently, we need to completely dismantle him. I intend to, I replied, pulling up a new highly encrypted communications window on my terminal. Compile everything, every single piece of evidence we have gathered today. For the next 2 hours, we built an ironclad digital dossier. It was a masterpiece of corporate espionage and undeniable legal proof. We included the forged loan origination documents from Blackwood Financial, clearly demonstrating that Darius had illegally leveraged my mother's house. We included the wire transfer receipts, proving the fraudulent source of his rental deposit. We attached the complete financial trace of his Ponzi structure, highlighting the illegal movement of funds between his various shell companies. To seal his fate entirely, I extracted the high-definition audio file from the security camera in the library hallway. The recording was crystal clear. Darius explicitly admitted to dodging debt collectors, treating the church members like a flock of sheep, and planning to funnel the $5 million to his shady partners. It was a direct, irrefutable confession. Once the massive digital file was compiled and encrypted, I did not call the local police. A crime of this magnitude involving wire fraud, bank fraud, and unregistered securities required a much heavier hand. In my line of work dealing with billionaires and massive real estate acquisitions, I had inevitably crossed paths with federal regulators. I had a direct, secure line to a highly ranked contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically within the white-collar crime division. Agent David Sterling and I had worked together 2 years ago when one of my elite properties was unknowingly targeted by an international money laundering syndicate. I had provided the Bureau with the necessary surveillance and documentation to dismantle that operation, earning a significant amount of mutual respect. I drafted a secure email to Agent Sterling. The subject line simply read, "Urgent. Apex Elite Estates. Multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme in progress. Active fraud event tomorrow night." I attached the encrypted dossier and provided the decryption key. In the body of the email, I outlined the exact nature of the scam, the specific targets involved, and the terrifying reality that Darius was planning to execute the final massive cash grab on my property the following evening. I detailed the guest list, noting the high-profile politicians and wealthy church members who were currently walking into a trap. But I did not just send the file and hope for the best. I needed this to be a public, inescapable execution of Darius's false empire. If the Bureau arrested him quietly at his home the next morning, my family would simply spin a narrative of persecution. Naya would play the victim. Clarice would claim the government was attacking a successful black man. They would never believe the truth unless they saw it violently dismantled in front of their own eyes, surrounded by the very society they were trying to impress. I typed my final instructions to Agent Sterling. The suspect will be hosting a large-scale investor gala at my Buckhead property tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. He plans to solicit $5 million in fraudulent investments from the attendees. I will grant your federal agents full unrestricted access to the estate. My security team will lock down the perimeter. You have my absolute cooperation to execute the arrest on site. I reviewed the email one last time. There was no hesitation. There was no lingering sense of family loyalty to hold me back. Family did not forge signatures and steal homes. Family did not prey on the elderly. Darius had chosen to play a ruthless game, and he was about to learn what happened when you sat down at a table with someone who actually knew how to destroy you. I hit send. The progress bar flashed across the screen, confirming the secure transmission of the dossier to the federal database. The digital bomb was officially armed. The timer was set. I closed the terminal and stood up, smoothing the front of my suit jacket. Tomorrow night I would put on my finest attire. I would walk through the front doors of my own $40 million mansion. I would smile at my mother, I would take the coats from my sister, and I would watch their entire world burn to the ground. The following evening arrived with the heavy, humid heat typical of an Atlanta summer. But the atmosphere outside my Buckhead estate was entirely different. As my private driver navigated the Maybach down the street toward my own property, the sheer scale of Darius's delusion became visually apparent. A massive line of luxury vehicles stretched down the block. Valets in crisp white jackets were frantically sprinting back and forth, parking gleaming Ferraris, sleek Porsches, and custom Rolls-Royces along the expansive cobblestone driveway. The exterior of the $40 million mansion was illuminated by dozens of high-intensity architectural lights, casting dramatic shadows against the glass and steel facade. It looked like a movie premiere or a high-stakes political fundraiser. Darius had truly pulled out all the stops to build his house of cards. I watched from the tinted windows of my car, noting the private security guards positioned at the front gates holding digital tablets. They were checking names off the guest list, totally oblivious to the fact that the woman sitting in the idling vehicle across the street was the actual owner signing their paychecks. The mansion was packed to absolute capacity with an incredibly dangerous mix of people. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the distinct factions mingling in the grand gallery. On one side, there were the wealthy, connected members of the Atlanta elite. I recognized a few local politicians, a couple of mid-level real estate developers, and a state senator who was notorious for attending any event that promised free top-tier champagne. They were the bait Darius needed to legitimize his operation. On the other side of the room, clustered tightly around the lavish catering stations, were the primary targets, the wealthy church members. These were the men and women who had known me since I was a child, the people who trusted my mother implicitly. They wore their Sunday best, looking slightly intimidated by the soaring 30-foot ceilings and the $2 million abstract sculpture I had approved just yesterday. They were clutching their designer handbags and sipping their drinks, completely unaware that they were being fattened up for the slaughter. Waiters carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and wagyu beef sliders weaved effortlessly through the crowd, creating an intoxicating illusion of boundless financial prosperity. I instructed my driver to wait and stepped out into the warm evening air. But I did not walk up to the front doors just yet. I stood in the shadows near the edge of the manicured lawn, watching the performance unfold through the glass. My mother, Clarice, was in her absolute element. She was strutting around the formal living room, acting like the grand matriarch of a multi-generational dynasty. She was wearing a deep emerald green evening gown that I immediately recognized. It was a high-end designer rental. I had seen the exact same dress in a luxury boutique window downtown earlier that week. But Clarice wore it like she had purchased it in Paris. She was holding court with a group of older churchwomen, laughing loudly and gesturing expansively toward the custom Italian leather sofas and the imported marble floors. I could practically read her lips from outside. She was taking credit for everything. She was pointing at the architecture, beaming with pride as she undoubtedly told her friends that this was the life her brilliant son-in-law had built. She looked so incredibly smug, so deeply satisfied with her fabricated social dominance. She had completely erased the memory of throwing her own daughter out into the street just 48 hours prior. To her, I was merely a necessary sacrifice on the altar of her public image. She genuinely believed her presence in this house was a divine blessing, never realizing it was actually a meticulously designed snare. Moving my gaze toward the center of the grand foyer, I spotted my sister. Naya was playing the role of the perfect billionaire's wife with sickening dedication. She was draped in a black velvet dress with a plunging neckline, and she was absolutely dripping in diamonds. A massive necklace, a heavy bracelet, and dangling chandelier earrings caught the light every time she turned her head. But to anyone who truly understood luxury jewelry, the stones lacked the icy depth of genuine diamonds. They were high-grade cubic zirconia, sparkling aggressively, but lacking any real substance. It was the perfect metaphor for her entire life. She clung tightly to Darius's arm, flashing brilliant smiles at the politicians and aggressively networking with the wives of the wealthy deacons. Darius himself looked like a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit perfectly, but his smile was rigid. He was sweating slightly around his hairline, constantly checking his phone and scanning the room with manic energy. I watched him corner a retired surgeon from the congregation, placing a heavy hand on the older man's shoulder, smiling like a shark as he likely pitched his fraudulent investment fund. He was hunting. He was calculating exactly how much cash was standing in the room and praying the federal authorities were not watching. He had no idea that his executioner was currently admiring his suit from the lawn. I smoothed the lapels of my custom Tom Ford power suit. I was not wearing a cheap polyester uniform. I was not hiding in the back room organizing coats. I was wearing a razor-sharp tailored black suit with a plunging silk camisole underneath, paired with my signature Louboutin heels. I looked exactly like what I was, a wealthy, untouchable chief executive officer. I walked up the cobblestone driveway, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, cutting through the noise of the valets and the idling engines. I bypassed the line of guests waiting at the security checkpoint. The head of the private security detail stepped forward to block my path, looking down at his tablet with a stern expression. "Excuse me, miss," he said firmly, raising a hand to halt my progress. I need to see your invitation before you can proceed to the main entrance. I did not stop walking. I simply looked him directly in the eye and spoke in a low, commanding tone. I am Zariah Washington. You are operating on an Apex Elite Estates property. Step aside. The guard instantly recognized the name of the corporate entity that held his contract. His eyes widened, his posture stiffening as the realization hit him. He immediately stepped back, opening the heavy glass door for me, with a deeply respectful nod, completely ignoring the confused murmurs of the people waiting in line behind me. I walked into the grand foyer of my own home. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted hors d'oeuvres, and desperate ambition. The string quartet playing in the corner was nearly drowned out by the overlapping chatter of 100 guests. For a brief moment, no one noticed me. I walked over to the nearest passing waiter, plucked a flute of vintage champagne from his silver tray, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the cold, crisp liquid coat my throat as my eyes swept across the room, taking inventory of the players on the board. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw the exact moment Nia spotted me. She had been laughing at a joke made by the mayor's chief of staff, throwing her head back in an exaggerated display of amusement. But her smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of absolute horror and boiling rage. She excused herself abruptly and marched straight toward me, her heels stomping aggressively against the marble floor. Her face was flushed and her eyes were wide with panic. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of my suit, and tried to aggressively pull me toward the hallway leading to the service entrance. "What are you wearing?" Nia hissed, her voice a frantic, venomous whisper. She looked me up and down, completely bewildered by the Tom Ford suit and the absolute lack of submission in my posture. "Are you insane? The coats are in the back. You are supposed to be working. Go hide before you embarrass Darius in front of the mayor." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until she felt the intense, freezing weight of my gaze and slowly let go, her confidence faltering for just a fraction of a second. I took another leisurely sip of my champagne, maintaining absolute eye contact. Nia was practically vibrating with anxiety. She glanced nervously over her shoulder to make sure none of the high-profile guests were watching us bicker in the foyer. "You need to get into the coat room right now," she demanded, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "You are ruining everything. We are doing million-dollar deals tonight, Zariah. This is the most important night of our lives. If Mom sees you out here mingling with the guests in a fake designer suit, she is going to absolutely lose her mind and have security drag you out into the street. You do not belong out here." I looked at my younger sister. I looked at her fake diamonds, her frantic energy, and her pathetic desperation to maintain a lie that was actively destroying the lives of the people she grew up with. She was so convinced of her own superiority, so entirely blind to the reality of her situation, that she actually believed she held the power to banish me to a closet. I smiled. It was a slow, predatory smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I brushed past her, my shoulder bumping hers just hard enough to make her stumble slightly in her high heels. "I am exactly where I belong, Nia," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the sound of the string quartet. I continued walking straight into the center of the formal living room, leaving her standing frozen in the foyer, her jaw completely slacked as she watched me confidently enter the crowd. I had entered the arena and the game was officially over. I walked away from Nia, letting the sea of expensive perfume and tailored suits swallow me. The grand gallery of my home was buzzing with the kind of frantic energy that always precedes a major financial transaction. I moved gracefully through the room, occasionally nodding at a familiar face from my mother's church, though none of them recognized me in this context. To them, I was just another wealthy investor, another shark swimming in the deep end of the pool. I positioned myself near the base of the grand staircase, a prime viewing spot for the performance I knew was about to begin. The string quartet finished their set, their final notes hanging in the humid air, and the ambient lighting in the room dimmed slightly. A single spotlight illuminated the landing of the sweeping marble staircase. The crowd naturally quieted down, turning their attention toward the light. It was time. Darius stepped into the spotlight, holding a silver microphone. He looked every inch the successful hedge fund manager he was pretending to be. His posture was relaxed, his smile bright and perfectly practiced. Nia stood 2 steps below him, gazing up at him with an expression of absolute adoration that made my stomach turn. He tapped the microphone twice. The soft thumping sound echoed through the massive foyer, commanding total silence. He welcomed everyone to what he called the inaugural gathering of the Vanguard Pinnacle Holdings Inner Circle. He spoke with the smooth rhythmic cadence of a seasoned televangelist, seamlessly blending the language of high finance with the spiritual manipulation he knew would hook the church congregation. He talked about building generational wealth, about breaking the chains of financial limitation, and about how God rewards those who are bold enough to seize opportunity. He was incredibly charismatic. I had to give him that. If I did not know the absolute truth, if I had not personally reviewed the forged deeds and the predatory loan documents, I might have actually believed the words coming out of his mouth. I watched the faces in the crowd as Darius continued his speech. The older church members were completely captivated. Their eyes were wide, absorbing every single lie he fed them. He told them that traditional banks were designed to keep them poor, that standard retirement accounts were a trap created by a rigged system. He offered them an exclusive alternative. He announced that for tonight only, he was opening the doors to a private high-yield real estate development fund that was previously reserved only for institutional investors. He promised guaranteed returns of 20% within the first year. It was a mathematical impossibility, a blatant lie that defied every basic principle of economics. But to the people standing in my foyer, it sounded like salvation. He paced back and forth on the marble landing using broad, sweeping hand gestures to emphasize his points. He spoke about legacy, about leaving behind a financial empire for their grandchildren, manipulating their deepest desires for security. Then he dropped the hook. He stated that because this fund was so exclusive, so closely guarded by the financial elite, the minimum buy-in to secure a position was exactly $100,000. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I watched the physical shift in the room. For the wealthy politicians and corporate attorneys standing near the bar, that was a standard networking fee, a drop in the bucket. But for the retired deacons and the elderly widows from the congregation, that number was staggering. That was their entire life savings. That was the hard-earned equity in their family homes. That was the safety net they had spent 4 decades building. And Darius, wearing a suit paid for by a predatory shadow loan, was asking them to hand it over to a completely fabricated shell company with a smile. He paused, letting the magnitude of the number settle over the room. He looked out over the sea of faces, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He was completely intoxicated by his own perceived power. He felt like a king holding court in his castle. But a king always needs a peasant to highlight his royalty. He needed a prop, a physical representation of the failure he was warning them against. His eyes scanned the crowd, likely looking for a sympathetic face to anchor his next point. Instead, his gaze landed directly on me. I was standing in the second row of the crowd, my arms relaxed at my sides, my Tom Ford suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the soft lighting. I did not shrink away from his stare. I looked right back at him, my expression completely unreadable. I saw the brief flicker of confusion cross his face as he took in my appearance. I did not look like the broke, struggling sister-in-law he had expected to see wearing a coat-check uniform. But Darius was too far gone. His ego was writing checks his reality could not cash. Instead of ignoring me and continuing with his pitch, he decided to double down. He decided to use me as his ultimate cautionary tale. He gripped the microphone, his smile widening into a condescending smirk. "You know, building this kind of wealth requires a specific mindset," Darius said, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system I had personally installed. "It requires vision. It requires the willingness to support those around you. Not everyone has that mindset. In fact, some people actively fight against it." He raised his free hand and pointed a single perfectly manicured finger directly at me. The spotlight seemed to bleed slightly, casting a harsh glow in my direction. "Take my sister-in-law Zariah, for example," he announced to the entire room. The collective gaze of 200 people suddenly shifted toward me. I felt the weight of their stares, a heavy, suffocating pressure that would have crushed the girl I used to be. Look at her, Darius continued, his tone dripping with fake pity. She has struggled her whole life. She works a grueling, low-paying job hauling furniture, barely making ends meet. Just yesterday, my beautiful wife Nia and I asked her for a simple favor to help launch this very fund. We presented her with a golden ticket. We gave her the opportunity to step out of her mediocre life and be part of something massive, something that is going to change the financial landscape of this city. And do you know what she did? She refused. She turned her back on her own blood because she was too afraid to take a calculated risk. She let her bitterness, her jealousy, and her small-mindedness hold her back from greatness. Darius shook his head, his voice dripping with theatrical disappointment. It breaks my heart, it really does. Because while the rest of us are moving forward, while we are securing multi-million-dollar estates like the one you are all standing in right now, she is choosing to remain stagnant. He paused dramatically, placing a hand over his heart. He was playing the benevolent savior, the wealthy patriarch who was generous even to those who wronged him. But Nia and I, we do not hold grudges, he said, his voice softening into a tone of absolute hypocrisy. We believe in grace. We believe that success is the best revenge, but it is also the best teacher. We would not even let her mother cast her aside completely. We still invited her here tonight. We brought her into this $40 million estate not to punish her, but to show her what hard work, dedication, and a true winner's mindset actually looks like. We wanted her to see what happens when you stop making excuses and start making moves. We love you, Zariah, we really do. We really, even if you are the ultimate cautionary tale for everyone standing in this room tonight. Please, everyone give a round of applause for Zaria, who is learning a very hard lesson about family and finance tonight. The absolute audacity of his speech hung in the air like toxic smoke. He had just attempted to publicly humiliate me in front of the mayor, several state senators, and every prominent member of my mother's church. He had framed my refusal to mortgage my condo for his scam as a personal failure of character. The room fell into a dead, agonizingly awkward silence. The massive air conditioning system hummed faintly in the background, the only sound breaking the heavy quiet. No one clapped. The politicians looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and staring at their expensive shoes. The church members stared at me with wide eyes, a mixture of pity and shock painted across their faces. I glanced over at my mother, Clarice. She was standing near the front, flanked by her choir friends. She dramatically placed a hand over her chest and looked down at the floor, shaking her head slowly. She was covering her face in mock embarrassment, playing the role of the heartbroken mother who was tragically burdened by a failure of a daughter. She was entirely complicit in this public execution. Nia, standing just below Darius on the stairs, did not even try to hide her amusement. She looked directly at me and smirked a cruel, victorious smile that told me she had likely helped him write that exact speech. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity in the most public way possible. But I did not blush. I did not lower my head. I did not turn around and run out the heavy glass doors like a frightened child. I stood perfectly still, my posture completely relaxed. The silence stretched on, becoming heavier and more uncomfortable by the second. Darius stood on the stairs, his smug smile faltering slightly as he waited for me to break. He expected tears. He expected me to scream or flee. Instead, I slowly raised my hands. I brought my palms together in a single loud, deliberate clap. The sharp sound echoed through the silent grand foyer like a gunshot. I pulled my hands apart and brought them together again. Clap. I did not speed up. I kept the rhythm slow, steady, and dripping with absolute freezing condescension. Clap. I tilted my head slightly, my eyes locking onto his. I looked right through his flashy, tailored suit, right through his fake designer watch, and his desperate bravado straight into the terrified core of the fraud he truly was. I knew the federal agents were already staging their vehicles down the street. I knew the digital trap I had set was fully armed and ready to detonate. Clap. The sound bounced off the imported marble floors and the soaring 30-foot ceilings, filling the room with an undeniable, suffocating tension. The triumphant smirk slowly melted off Nia's face, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. My mother lifted her head, her fake performance of embarrassment completely forgotten as confusion washed over her features. Darius gripped the silver microphone tighter, his knuckles turning white as he stared down at me. He had expected to break me, but my slow, echoing applause was not a sign of surrender. It was the terrifying sound of a judge striking a gavel. It was the countdown to his absolute destruction. I let the final echo of my applause fade into the heavy air of the foyer. Darius stared at me, his chest heaving slightly, his mind struggling to comprehend why I was not cowering in shame. He opened his mouth to speak, to hurl another insult, or demand my removal, but I did not give him the chance. I lowered my hands and reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers closed around the smooth, cold metal of my secure corporate phone. I pulled it out, keeping my eyes locked on his face. I did not break eye contact as my thumb hovered over the screen, resting on the master override application for the estate. I tapped a single button. Instantly, the entire atmosphere of the $40 million mansion violently shifted. The string quartet in the corner was cut off mid-note as the smart home system overrode their amplifiers. The sudden absolute silence was deafening. A split second later, a loud, heavy, and undeniably final mechanical click echoed through the massive room. Then another, and another. Every single custom glass and steel smart door on the perimeter of the estate locked simultaneously. The sound was like a prison vault sealing shut. The wealthy guests gasped, looking around in sudden confusion as the physical exits were digitally barricaded. But the psychological terror truly began with the lights. The warm, inviting amber ambient lighting that Darius had requested to make the space feel intimate was instantly extinguished. In its place, the glaring, cold, unforgiving white light of the maximum security protocol flooded the grand foyer. It was the kind of harsh, clinical illumination used in interrogation rooms and high-security vaults. Under that brutal light, all the manufactured illusions vanished. Nia's fake diamond jewelry no longer sparkled with warmth. It just looked like cheap, cloudy glass. The expensive rental gown my mother wore suddenly looked rigid and out of place. Darius looked sickly, the sweat on his forehead shining brightly under the intense glare. The luxurious party had been instantly transformed into a sterile crime scene. Murmurs of panic began to ripple through the crowd. The politicians exchanged nervous glances, their self-preservation instincts kicking in. The church members clutched their designer bags closer to their chests, looking toward my mother for an explanation she could not provide. Clarice was spinning around in circles, demanding to know who was messing with the electrical panel. Nia grabbed Darius's arm, her fingernails digging into his tuxedo jacket, asking him what was happening. But Darius had no answers. He tapped the silver microphone frantically, but it was dead. I had severed his connection to the main audio feed. He was completely powerless. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. The crowd naturally parted for me as I took my first step toward the grand marble staircase. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate, and absolute authority of a woman who owned every single inch of the ground beneath her feet. The guests stepped back, creating a wide, clear path. They did not know who I was, but they could feel the sheer, undeniable power radiating from my posture. I was no longer the struggling sister-in-law they had just been told to pity. I was the architect of this entire evening. I reached the bottom of the staircase and began to ascend. My Christian Louboutin heels clicked sharply against the imported Italian marble, echoing rhythmically in the stark, bright room. Each step I took was a physical dismantling of their hierarchy. Nia watched me climb closer, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She instinctively took a step backward, shrinking away from my presence. Darius stood frozen on the landing, his charismatic facade completely shattered. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for a way out that simply did not exist. I reached the landing and stepped directly into his personal space. I did not yell, I did not push him. I simply reached out and took the silver microphone right out of his trembling hand. He did not even try to resist. His grip was weak, his fingers clammy and shaking. I turned away from him and faced the sea of 200 confused, terrified guests. I tapped the base of the microphone. It flared to life, instantly reconnected to the audio system by my digital command. When I spoke, my voice was ice cold, perfectly calm, and massively amplified. It cut through the nervous whispers of the crowd like a freshly sharpened blade. "Darius, you talk a lot about hard work," I said, not bothering to turn around to look at him. My voice filled every corner of the massive estate, echoing off the 30-foot ceilings. "You just stood up here and delivered a beautiful sermon about vision, about dedication, and about securing multi-million-dollar assets. You wanted to use me as a cautionary tale. So let us talk about this $40 million house you claim to have secured." I gestured with my free hand, sweeping it slowly across the expanse of the room. "It is a beautiful property, is it not? The open concept gallery, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the exact shade of the Italian marble beneath your feet. I know it is beautiful because I picked out the marble myself. I negotiated the purchase of this land. I commissioned the architects, and I personally signed off on every single detail of this estate." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd, the sound of 200 people simultaneously realizing they were standing in the middle of a massive lie. I looked directly at my mother, Clarice. She was standing frozen near the catering tables, her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide with absolute horrifying shock. The emerald green dress she had been strutting around in suddenly seemed to weigh her down. She shook her head side to side, silently refusing to process the words coming out of my mouth. Nia let out a small, pathetic whimper from the step below me. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the library corridor opened. Elias emerged from the shadows. He looked like an executioner dressed in a flawless navy blue suit. He walked through the parted crowd with lethal purpose, carrying a thick black leather folder. The guests watched him in stunned silence as he climbed the marble stairs and stopped right beside me. He did not look at Darius or Nia. He simply opened the folder and handed me two distinct, legally bound documents. I held the documents up in the glaring white light for the entire room to see. "This is the official deed to this property," I announced, my voice remaining deadly calm and unwavering. "And this is the short-term corporate rental agreement." I turned my head slightly, finally locking eyes with the sweating, trembling man standing beside me. Darius stared at the papers as if I were holding a loaded weapon. "You did not secure this estate through your high-level financial connections, Darius. You rented it for one night from my corporate holding company. You rented it from my blind trust, completely unaware that the woman you threw out of your house on Sunday was the exact same woman who owned the walls you are standing inside today." Nia covered her mouth with both hands, a choked sob escaping her throat. "It is not true," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the undeniable reality. "She is lying. Darius, tell them she is lying." But Darius could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The slick, confident wealth manager was gone, replaced by a terrified fraud who had just been cornered by the absolute truth. I turned my attention back to the crowd. Specifically, I looked directly at the retired deacons and the elderly widows from the church. I looked at the people who had their checkbooks in their purses, ready to hand over their life savings to a criminal. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Elite Estates," I declared, my voice echoing with finality. "And according to Clause 14 of the specialized addendum in the contract you blindly signed yesterday morning, Darius, your lease is officially terminated, effective immediately." I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice just enough so that it felt intimate, yet still perfectly amplified for the entire room to hear. "The clause specifically states that the lease is instantly voided if the tenant is found to be conducting fraudulent business, operating an unregistered Ponzi scheme, or utilizing stolen funds on my property." The word fraud hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. The wealthy politicians immediately stepped back, physically distancing themselves from the center of the room. The church members began to shout, demanding answers, asking about the money they had already invested. The polished, elegant gala completely dissolved into a chaotic, panicked frenzy. But I was not finished. I had to ensure the destruction was total. I had to make sure there was absolutely no room for them to spin a new narrative tomorrow. You stood on my staircase and told these good people that you had millions in offshore accounts. I continued speaking directly over the rising clamor of the crowd. You told my mother that I was a failure because I would not sign my home over to you. But I know exactly how you paid the $150,000 deposit to rent my house tonight. And I think the people you are trying to steal from deserve to know exactly what kind of man is asking for their life savings. I raised my hand again, pointing toward the massive digital projection wall that Darius had set up behind the staircase to display his fake financial charts. Julian, who was manning the control room downstairs, executed the final command. The screen flickered to life, but it did not show the Vanguard Pinnacle Holdings logo. It displayed a massive, high-definition scan of a loan origination document from Blackwood Financial. And right at the bottom, glowing brightly in the cold white light, was the forged signature of Clarice Washington. I watched as the crowd turned their heads to read the document projected on the wall. The legal jargon was dense, but the bold red text highlighting the residential address used as collateral was impossible to miss. It was a brutal, unavoidable display of ultimate betrayal. The shadow lender's terms were laid bare for everyone to scrutinize. The exorbitant interest rates, the predatory clauses, and the absolute certainty of foreclosure were broadcast in striking high definition. I made sure Julian zoomed in closely on the signature line, allowing the shaky, poorly copied letters of my mother's name to fill the screen. Every single person in the room who knew my family recognized that address. They recognized that it was not a commercial asset or a corporate holding. It was the house where my mother hosted her choir rehearsals. It was the house where she had raised her children. It was the house she prided herself on owning free and clear. The silence that followed the display of that document was entirely different from the silence before. It was not a silence of anticipation. It was a silence of collective horror. The people in the crowd were looking at Darius not just as a liar, but as a predator who would sacrifice his own family to feed his ego. I held the microphone steady, my grip firm and uncompromising. The deed and the rental agreement remained visible in my other hand, undeniable physical proof of my absolute ownership and his complete failure. The trap had not just been sprung. It had violently snapped shut, crushing the fake empire he had spent years trying to build. I stood on the marble landing, staring down at the wreckage of their delusions, knowing that the most devastating blow was still yet to come. The blackout and the reveal were complete, but the reckoning had only just begun. Nia's voice broke the suffocating silence. "She is lying!" Nia screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly against the marble walls. She let go of Darius's arm and took a step up the staircase toward me, her face contorted with desperate rage. She fabricated all of this. She is a jealous, bitter woman who cannot stand to see us succeed. Do not look at that screen. It is a fake. Darius is a brilliant wealth manager, and she is just a struggling decorator trying to ruin the most important night of our lives. She turned frantically toward the crowd, waving her hands, the fake cubic zirconia bracelets clanking cheaply around her wrists. Please, everyone, do not listen to her. The fund is real. The millions are real. She hacked into the system to display those documents. She is insane. But the crowd did not murmur in agreement. The politicians did not nod. The church members did not offer her sympathetic glances. They simply stared at her with a mixture of pity and severe judgment. The undeniable truth was already burned into their minds. Nia was fighting a ghost trying to reconstruct a glass house that had already been pulverized into dust. I did not even dignify my sister's frantic screams with a response. I completely ignored her. I shifted my gaze away from Nia's manic display and looked directly down at the front row of the crowd, locking my eyes onto the one person whose judgment mattered the most: my mother. Clarice was standing completely frozen. The vibrant emerald green of her rented designer gown now seemed to mock the sickening pallor of her face. The smug, self-righteous matriarch who had proudly strutted through my foyer just 20 minutes ago had completely vanished. In her place stood a terrified, aging woman who was slowly realizing that the golden pedestal she had placed her son-in-law upon was actually a trapdoor leading straight to hell. Her eyes darted from me standing powerfully on the staircase to Darius, who was practically shrinking into his tuxedo, and finally to the massive digital screen displaying the loan origination document. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure every single person in the room was hanging on my next word. I raised the microphone slightly. "Mom," I said, my voice echoing with a haunting calm. The words sliced through Nia's hysterical sobbing and forced Clarice to look up at me. "Just 2 days ago, you sat at your polished mahogany dining table and told me that my credit score was not worth more than this man's future. You demanded that I sign my own home over to him. And when I refused to fund a scam, you physically threw my coat out the front door and kicked me out of your house to protect him." Clarice opened her mouth, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to plead, but her throat was completely dry. No sound emerged. She simply clutched her half-empty crystal champagne glass tighter, her knuckles turning white. "You chose him." I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of the desperate need for her approval that used to plague my childhood. "You told me that family steps up when a loved one is on the verge of greatness. But did you ever stop to ask yourself how he suddenly found the money to secure this $40 million estate? Did you know how he actually paid the $150,000 non-refundable deposit to stand in my house tonight?" I did not wait for her to answer. I raised my left hand, signaling Julian in the security control room below. Instantly, the image on the massive digital projection wall behind me shifted. The dense paragraphs of the predatory lending terms faded away, replaced by a hyper-magnified high-definition scan of the document's final page. The image was blown up to massive proportions, spanning 20 feet across the wall. Right in the center of the screen, illuminated in the harsh, unforgiving white light, was the signature block. I watched Clarice's eyes widen until they were completely rimmed with white. She recognized the address printed above the signature line. It was her address, the home she had lived in for 3 decades, the property she owned free and clear. And right below it was her name written in a hesitant, overly rounded cursive script that she immediately knew she had never penned. "He forged your signature, Mom," I said, dropping the second bomb with lethal precision. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He did not use offshore accounts. He did not use corporate venture capital. He used your house. The exact same house you threw me out of on Sunday afternoon. He used it as illegal collateral to secure a massive cash loan from Blackwood Financial, a predatory shadow lender known for destroying lives. A collective gasp rippled through the church congregation. Deacon Hayes covered his mouth in shock. Mrs. Gable took a staggering step backward, grabbing the arm of the person next to her for support. They all knew how much Clarice valued that house. It was her sanctuary, her primary source of pride, her ultimate status symbol within their community. "Darius took their money, forged your name, and bet your entire life on this fake gala," I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly. "He is legally bound to a high-interest loan that he has absolutely no intention of repaying. And because you are the guarantor on that fraudulent document, the shadow lender holds the deed. If you do not pay them back their $200,000 plus exorbitant penalty fees by Monday morning, they will file a lien. You will be foreclosed upon. You are going to be homeless." The word homeless hit Clarice like a physical blow to the chest. Her entire body convulsed. For decades, she had constructed her entire identity around her perceived wealth, her social standing, and her pristine reputation. She had looked down on me, alienated me, and humiliated me because she thought I did not measure up to her standard of success. And now, the golden son-in-law she had championed over her own flesh and blood had systematically stripped her of everything she owned. The crystal champagne glass slipped from Clarice's trembling fingers. It hit the imported Italian marble floor with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into hundreds of glittering pieces. The champagne splashed across the hem of her rented emerald gown, staining the expensive fabric, but she did not even notice. The sound of the shattering glass broke the spell of shock that had paralyzed her. The pious, composed church choir director completely evaporated. A primal, guttural scream ripped from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and blinding rage. "You stole my house!" Clarice shrieked, her voice cracking as she lunged forward. She threw herself up the first two steps of the marble staircase, completely bypassing Nia, and launched herself directly at Darius. She slammed her fists into his chest, grabbing the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo and shaking him violently. "You liar! You thief! You took my home! How could you do this to me? I trusted you. I vouched for you." Darius stumbled backward, his arms flailing as he tried to defend himself against the furious assault of his mother-in-law. He looked terrified, completely out of his depth. "Clarice, stop. Please let me explain. I can fix this. I just need the investments to clear tonight, and I can buy the house back. I swear to God I can fix it." "There are no investments," I announced into the microphone, my voice easily cutting over the chaotic scuffle happening on the stairs below me. "There is no wealth management fund. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. Every single dollar handed to Vanguard Pinnacle Holdings has already been used to pay off older debts and fund his fake lifestyle. The accounts are completely empty, Lee." That final revelation was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The elite investors in the room, the men and women who had written massive checks just moments before, suddenly realized the full extent of the scam. The initial shock morphed instantly into explosive, uncontrollable outrage. "I transferred $100,000 into your account yesterday morning," Deacon Hayes roared, pushing his way through the crowd toward the staircase. His face was purple with fury. "Give me my money back right now, you worthless con artist." "He took $50,000 from my retirement fund," another church member screamed, her voice rising in panic. "Call the police." "Do not let him leave this building. He stole our pensions." Total chaos erupted inside the grand foyer. The carefully curated atmosphere of high society elegance was completely obliterated, replaced by the raw, terrifying energy of an angry mob. The local politicians and corporate attorneys immediately pulled out their cell phones, dialing their legal teams and shouting instructions, desperate to distance themselves from the toxic fallout of a federal crime. The state senator who had been laughing with Nia just half an hour ago practically sprinted toward the locked front doors, demanding to be let out. Several of the younger, more aggressive investors surged forward, surrounding the base of the staircase. They were shouting threats, demanding immediate wire transfers, their faces twisted in rage. Darius was completely trapped. Clarice was still hitting him, screaming hysterically about her house, while Naya stood on the sidelines, weeping uncontrollably, her fake billionaire lifestyle collapsing around her in real time. Darius tried to push Clarice away, his eyes wild with panic. "Back off," he yelled at the approaching crowd, his voice cracking with fear. "Everyone just calm down. It is a misunderstanding. The money is safe. The fund is real." "Liar," someone screamed from the back of the room. "You are going to prison." People began to push and shove. A silver catering tray was knocked off a nearby table, sending expensive hors d'oeuvres scattering across the marble floor. A floral centerpiece crashed to the ground, the sound of breaking porcelain adding to the rising cacophony of shouts, accusations, and frantic phone calls. The private security guards I had stationed around the perimeter stepped forward, not to protect Darius, but to form a physical barrier preventing the mob from completely overrunning the stairs. I stood on the landing above the fray, completely untouched by the madness unfolding below me. I held the deed to my mansion in one hand and the microphone in the other, observing the absolute destruction of their false empire. I watched my mother unravel. I watched my sister weep over her fake diamonds, and I watched Darius cower in terror as the very people he had tried to swindle demanded his head. They had built their entire lives on lies, manipulation, and the cruel subjugation of my worth. They had demanded my home to finance their greed. Now, under the harsh, glaring security lights of my $40 million estate, they were reaping the exact harvest they had sown. The reckoning was not just complete. It was an absolute, inescapable masterpiece of justice. And as the sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing down the long cobblestone driveway, I knew the final act of this tragedy was about to unfold with a brutal, satisfying finality. No one could escape the consequences of tonight. The wail of the sirens grew louder, slicing through the chaotic screams and accusations of the angry mob filling my grand foyer. At first, the sound was just a faint, high-pitched hum in the distance, easily dismissed by the panicked investors who were too busy demanding their life savings back from a sweating cornered Darius. But within seconds, the noise swelled into a deafening, mechanical roar that vibrated against the massive glass panels of the mansion. The red and blue emergency lights of multiple federal vehicles pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting violent spinning shadows across the imported Italian marble and the terrified faces of Atlanta's high society. The flashing colors mixed with the harsh cold white of my security lighting, turning the elegant gala into an undeniable crime scene. The sudden arrival of law enforcement acted like a bucket of ice water thrown over the entire room. The shouting abruptly stopped. The shoving ceased. Even my mother, who had been physically assaulting Darius on the marble staircase, froze mid-strike. Clarice slowly lowered her trembling hands, her chest heaving as she turned her head toward the front entrance. The realization of what those flashing lights meant hit her with the force of a freight train. She was not just losing her house to a predatory shadow lender. She was standing in the epicenter of a massive federal raid surrounded by the very church congregation she had sworn to protect. Her precious reputation, the social standing she had spent her entire life cultivating at the expense of her own daughter, was about to be broadcast as a cautionary tale on the evening news. Nia collapsed onto the second step of the staircase, the strength completely leaving her legs. She stared at the spinning red and blue lights reflecting off the expensive chandeliers, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The reality of her situation was finally piercing through the thick armor of her delusion. She was not a billionaire's wife. She was the accomplice to a massive financial fraud, and the authorities had arrived to collect their due. I did not panic. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my secure corporate phone, and tapped the master override button a second time. "Unlock the perimeter," I instructed Julian through the secure intercom channel, my voice steady and unwavering. "Let them in." The heavy mechanical locks on the custom glass and steel front doors disengaged with a loud, unified click. The heavy oak doors swung open violently, pushed wide by the imposing figures of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A team of 12 heavily armed agents flooded into the grand foyer, their dark tactical windbreakers displaying the bold yellow letters of the Bureau. They moved with terrifying calculated precision, fanning out across the room to secure all possible exits. The sheer professionalism of their entrance completely neutralized any remaining resistance from the crowd. The wealthy politicians who were previously shouting into their cell phones instantly dropped their devices and raised their hands in a universal gesture of compliance. The church members huddled together, weeping quietly in the corners of the massive room. Agent David Sterling walked through the center of the formation. He was a tall, incredibly sharp investigator who had zero tolerance for financial predators. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in the shattered champagne glasses, the ruined catering displays, and the massive digital projection of the forged loan document still glowing brightly on the wall behind the staircase. He looked up at me standing on the landing, giving me a single crisp nod of acknowledgement. I had delivered exactly what I promised. A multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme wrapped up with a neat little bow served directly on a silver platter. I raised the silver microphone to my lips one last time. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the audio equipment was the only sound competing with the approaching footsteps of the federal agents. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy, terrified silence with absolute authority. "Please remain calm and keep your checkbooks closed. Vanguard Pinnacle Holdings is a fabricated shell company. Apex Capital is a textbook Ponzi scheme. The financial documents you are shown tonight are completely fraudulent, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation now has all the digital files, wire transfer receipts, and recorded confessions necessary to prosecute this crime." A collective sigh of relief mixed with utter disbelief swept through the crowd. Deacon Hayes lowered his head, whispering a prayer of thanks that he had not actually signed the check he was holding in his pocket. The retired widows hugged each other, realizing that while they had been deceived by my mother, their life savings were still safe in their own bank accounts. I had stopped the final transaction just in time. Agent Sterling marched directly to the base of the marble staircase, flanked by two burly agents. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for permission. He looked straight up at the sweating, trembling figure of my brother-in-law. Darius Vance, Agent Sterling, barked, his voice echoing with absolute legal authority. You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, forgery, and the solicitation of unregistered securities. Step down from the stairs and place your hands behind your back. Darius looked like a man who had just been ordered to step off a cliff. He shook his head frantically, his slicked back hair falling out of place, the sweat pouring down his face and soaking the collar of his expensive tuxedo. He took a pathetic step backward, bumping into the brass railing of the staircase. No, no, you have this all wrong. Darius stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. I am a legitimate wealth manager. I have offshore accounts. This is a massive misunderstanding. My sister-in-law set me up. She is trying to ruin my business. Ask anyone here. I am on the verge of securing generational wealth. Agent Sterling did not entertain the lie for a single second. We have your recorded conversation from the library hallway. Darius Sterling replied coldly. We have the forged deed to your mother-in-law's property. We have the wire transfers from Blackwood Financial. It is over. Come down here right now, or we will come up there and physically drag you down. Seeing that his slick words were entirely useless against federal evidence, Darius's bravado completely collapsed. He practically fell down the remaining 3 steps, landing directly in front of the federal agents. They grabbed his arms with practiced efficiency, twisting them behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs, locking around his wrists, echoed loudly in the grand foyer. It was the sound of his entire fake empire crashing down into dust. Agent Sterling began reciting the Miranda rights in a flat, monotonous voice, detailing the massive federal charges that were about to end Darius's life as a free man. Darius twisted his head around, his eyes wild with sheer terror. He looked past the agents, frantically searching for his wife. Nia, he screamed, his voice breaking in a pathetic display of cowardice. Nia, do something. Call my partners. Call the firm. Call a lawyer. We need the best defense attorney in Atlanta. Get Elias. Tell Zariah to hire Elias for me. But Nia was incapable of doing anything. The perfectly crafted illusion of the billionaire's wife had been completely decimated. She sat slumped on the marble steps, her face buried in her hands. She was sobbing hysterically, her shoulders shaking violently with every breath. When she finally looked up at her husband, the sight was pitiful. The expensive mascara she had carefully applied earlier that evening was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, staining her flawless makeup. Her fake diamond necklace hung crookedly around her neck. We do not have any partners, Darius. Nia choked out her voice, barely a whisper, completely broken by the reality of their massive debt. We do not have a firm. We do not even have enough money in our checking account to pay for the gas to drive home. How am I supposed to hire a lawyer when you just lost everything we ever had? The absolute devastation in her voice resonated through the silent room. She finally admitted the truth, speaking the words out loud in front of the mayor, the politicians, and the church congregation. They were broke, they were frauds, and now they were ruined. As Darius was forcefully turned around to face the front doors, the social destruction reached its absolute peak. The initial shock of the federal raid had worn off for the high society guests, replaced immediately by the ruthless instinct for self-preservation and gossip. All across the grand foyer, the wealthy elite pulled out their expensive smartphones. The bright flashes of dozens of cameras illuminated the room, capturing every humiliating second of the downfall. The politicians who had been shaking Darius's hand an hour ago were now recording him being marched out in handcuffs, ensuring they had proof they were merely innocent bystanders to his scam. The church members filmed the scene with grim expressions, capturing the absolute disgrace of Clarice Washington's golden son-in-law. Darius tried to duck his head, desperately trying to hide his face from the glowing lenses. But the federal agents held him firmly by the arms, forcing him to walk the gauntlet of public shame. He was marched past the custom Italian leather sofas he had insulted. He was paraded past the $2 million abstract sculpture he had claimed to own. He was escorted right through the heavy glass doors of my $40 million estate, completely stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and his false identity. I stood on the landing of the marble staircase, watching the entire procession from above. I did not record the moment. I did not need a video on my phone to remember this night. The image of Darius being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, with the red and blue lights flashing against the pristine white columns of my home, was permanently burned into my memory. Below me, the grand foyer was slowly clearing out. The federal agents were meticulously interviewing the guests, collecting the fake investment brochures as physical evidence and securing the perimeter. The glamorous gala had been officially reduced to a massive crime scene investigation. But the night was not quite over. While Darius was on his way to a federal holding cell, the true architects of my childhood misery were still standing inside my house. I looked down at the base of the stairs. Nia was still sitting on the cold marble, weeping openly into her hands, completely ignored by the very people she had spent years trying to impress. And standing just a few feet away from her was my mother, Clarice. Clarice was staring out the front doors, watching the taillights of the FBI vehicles disappear down the long driveway. She looked completely hollowed out, as if the very soul had been ripped from her body. Her reputation was dead. Her pride was shattered. And the predatory shadow lender was still holding the forged deed to her home. She slowly turned her head and looked up at me. The arrogant, demanding matriarch was gone. All that remained was a desperate, terrified woman who had just realized that the daughter she had thrown away was the only person left on Earth holding a life raft. The federal authorities had handled the criminal, but the emotional reckoning between a mother and her discarded daughter was finally at hand. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer swung shut with a resounding thud, instantly cutting off the frantic wailing of the federal sirens outside. The massive $40 million estate, which just moments ago was vibrating with the chaotic energy of a panicked mob, was suddenly plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. The air conditioning hummed softly, a mechanical drone that only amplified the emptiness of the room. The wealthy politicians, the terrified church members, and the federal agents had all vanished into the humid Atlanta night, leaving behind a devastating landscape of absolute ruin. The pristine imported Italian marble was covered in the wreckage of a shattered illusion. Overturned silver catering trays lay abandoned near the base of the stairs. Expensive Wagyu sliders and beluga caviar were mashed into the floor alongside trampled floral arrangements. Half-empty glasses of vintage champagne sat abandoned on every available surface, the bubbles long gone, leaving only flat, warm liquid behind. The grand gala had been completely hollowed out, leaving nothing but the ghosts of a massive financial crime. Only 3 people remained in the cavernous, brightly lit room. I stood tall on the landing of the marble staircase, my custom Tom Ford suit completely untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded. Below me, my sister Nia was curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the second step. And at the base of the stairs stood my mother, Clarice. She was staring blankly at the heavy oak doors, watching the flashing red and blue lights slowly fade away through the thick glass panels. The reality of her situation was finally piercing through the thick armor of her lifelong delusion. She was not just losing her social standing. The shadow loan, the forged signature, and the imminent foreclosure of her home crashed down upon her shoulders all at once. Clarice slowly turned away from the doors. Her legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, the stained emerald green fabric of her rented designer gown pooling around her in a pathetic heap. She did not just cry. She wailed. It was a guttural, terrifying sound of absolute, unconditional defeat. The pious, composed church choir director had been completely obliterated. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, the sharp shards of her broken champagne glass crunching loudly beneath her weight. She did not care that the glass was tearing at the expensive fabric of her dress. She reached the bottom of the staircase and looked up at me, her face completely slick with tears, her eyes wide with a manic, terrifying desperation. "Zariah, my baby." Clarice sobbed, reaching a trembling hand up toward my ankle. The endearment felt like a splash of corrosive acid. She had not called me her baby in 2 decades. "You are so successful. Look at this house. Look at the massive empire you built entirely on your own. You have millions of dollars. You are one of the most powerful women in this city. You have to save my house. You have to pay off the terrible debt Darius left behind with that awful lender. We are blood. We are family. You cannot just stand there and let your own mother become homeless on the streets of Atlanta. She was frantically gaslighting me, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative of our entire relationship in a matter of seconds. She was weaponizing the very concept of family she had so casually discarded when it suited her narrative. She expected the old Zariah to emerge the desperate, lonely girl who would do absolutely anything to earn a tiny scrap of her mother's affection. She honestly thought my hidden wealth meant I would automatically assume the role of her financial savior, wiping away the consequences of her own devastating arrogance. Hearing our mother beg on her hands and knees seemed to snap Nia out of her catatonic state. She pushed herself up from the marble steps, her face a terrifying mask of smeared black mascara and pale, trembling skin. She scrambled up the stairs toward me, her hands clasped tightly together in a gesture of desperate prayer. Her fake diamond bracelets clanked loudly against each other, a harsh reminder of the cheap lies that had brought her to this exact moment. "Zariah, please!" Nia choked out, her voice raw and breaking with every syllable. "Darius is going to a federal prison. They are going to lock my husband away for decades. He made a mistake, but he was just trying to provide for us. You saw that lawyer of yours, Elias. He is an absolute shark. He knows exactly how to handle the federal government. You have to hire Elias to defend Darius. You have the money to fix this. You can afford the best legal defense team in the entire state. Please save my husband. Save our family. You cannot just stand there on your pedestal and let our entire lives be destroyed over a financial misunderstanding." I looked down at the two women groveling at my feet. For my entire life, they had controlled the family dynamic. They had dictated my worth, isolated me from any genuine affection, and demanded my complete submission to their twisted, toxic hierarchy. Just 48 hours ago, they were laughing in my face as I was violently banished from my childhood home. They had mocked my career, belittled my existence, and proudly elevated a con artist above my own flesh and blood. Now the tables had not just turned. The entire board had been flipped over and set entirely on fire. They were begging the scapegoat to become their shield. I took a deliberate, measured step backward, pulling my shoe out of my mother's desperate, grasping reach. I did not cross my arms, I did not frown, I did not show a single ounce of anger or pity. My expression remained entirely unreadable, an impenetrable fortress of absolute calm that terrified them more than any screaming match ever could. I let the silence hang over them for a long, agonizing moment, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable, undeniable reality of their own devastating actions. "My baby." I repeated the words, tasting like dry ash in my mouth. My voice was perfectly modulated, completely devoid of the hysteria that was consuming them. "That is what you choose to call me now. Now that you know I own a $40 million estate. Now that you know I possess the power to write a single check that could make all of your terrifying problems magically disappear. But tell me, what exactly did you call me on Sunday afternoon?" Clarice choked on a massive sob, shaking her head frantically from side to side. "Please, Zariah, do not do this to me. I was angry. I was stressed about the gala. I did not mean the things I said. I was just trying to protect our family." "You meant every single syllable," I corrected her, my voice slicing effortlessly through her pathetic, manufactured excuses. "You sat at your perfectly polished mahogany dining table, holding a predatory commercial loan document in your hand. You demanded that I sign over the only asset I possess to finance the very scam that just got your golden son-in-law dragged out of my house in federal handcuffs. And when I absolutely refused to be a pawn in his game, you told me exactly where I stood in your heart." I looked down at her, my eyes completely devoid of any lingering sympathy. The invisible chains of childhood trauma that had bound me to her approval completely dissolved, leaving behind a woman made of forged steel. "You told me my credit was not worth his future." I recounted, reciting her exact words with chilling precision. "You told me that I was a useless disappointment to this family. You dragged my coat off the wooden rack, threw it onto the concrete porch, and told me to get out of your house. You violently banished me because I would not participate in your shared delusion. You willingly chose him over your own flesh and blood. You literally handed him the keys to your own destruction because you cared more about having a wealthy son-in-law to brag about at church than you cared about the well-being of your own daughter. I shifted my cold gaze to Nia, who was staring up at me with wide, horrified eyes, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. "And you?" I said, the temperature of my voice dropping even further. "You laughed at me. You stood in my foyer barely an hour ago and ordered me to go hide in the coat room so I would not embarrass you in front of the mayor. You proudly wore fake diamonds paid for by your mother's stolen equity, and you sneered at my existence. Darius is not a victim of a misunderstanding. He is a federal criminal who actively preyed on the elderly people you both claim to love. Elias is my corporate attorney. I pay him an exorbitant retainer to protect my empire from greedy parasites exactly like your husband. I will not spend a single cent of my hard-earned wealth to legally defend a man who tried to leverage my own mother's home to throw a fake networking party." Clarice let out another agonizing wail, burying her tear-stained face into her hands. She curled her body inward, rocking back and forth on the marble floor. "Zariah, I am begging you on my knees. I have nowhere else to go. The shadow lender will foreclose on Monday. I will lose absolutely everything I have ever worked for. You have to help me." I shook my head slowly, feeling the last remaining threads of familial obligations sever completely and permanently. "I am not your savior," I stated firmly, my voice ringing with absolute undeniable finality. "I am not the convenient financial safety net you can deploy when your precious golden child inevitably fails you. You made your choices, you bet your entire life, your home, and your sacred reputation on a man who lied directly to your face. And now you have to pay the ultimate devastating price for your own boundless arrogance." I looked around the empty, ruined grand foyer, taking in the shattered glass and the absolute silence of the massive estate. Then I looked back down at the two broken women sobbing on the floor. "I am not your savior. I am your landlord for the evening," I said softly, my voice devoid of any warmth. "And your time is up." I raised my hand, a silent but absolute command, directed at the deep shadows of the quiet, empty grand foyer. Julian stepped forward instantly, accompanied by my elite private security detail. They moved with quiet, intimidating efficiency. "Escort them off my property," I instructed, my voice echoing one final time in the cavernous space. Clarice tried to resist, reaching her trembling hands toward me, as if she could magically bridge the massive emotional chasm she had spent my childhood digging. But the security guards were impervious to her desperate tears. They firmly took her arms, lifting her off the cold floor. Nia did not even try to fight. She let the guards guide her toward the exit, her head hanging in absolute defeat, the broken heels of her expensive shoes dragging against the stone. I watched them walk toward the heavy glass and steel double doors. It was poetic symmetry. Just days prior, my mother had thrown my coat onto her concrete porch and banished me into the afternoon heat, believing she had stripped my dignity. Now she was being physically removed from my $40 million estate by men in tailored suits, leaving with nothing but the crushing weight of her mistakes. The heavy doors closed behind them with a final, definitive click, sealing them out of my world forever. The consequences of their arrogance unspooled rapidly over the next 8 months, an avalanche of justice that I watched from a comfortable distance. A federal judge did not share my mother's forgiving nature when it came to financial predators. The local evening news broadcast the final verdict across every television screen in Atlanta. The anchor's voice was crisp and clinical as she read the teleprompter. Former self-proclaimed wealth manager Darius Vance was sentenced today to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for orchestrating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme that targeted elderly church members. The judge cited the brazen use of forged property deeds as a key factor in the maximum sentencing. Without Darius's stolen funds to float her lavish lifestyle, Nia's manufactured reality completely evaporated. The luxury cars were immediately repossessed by the banks. The designer clothes were seized and liquidated to pay off their mounting legal fees. Her meticulously curated Instagram account, once a glittering shrine to her fake billionaire existence, was permanently deleted from the internet. The last time anyone saw my sister, she was wearing a stiff polyester uniform, scanning barcodes behind the register of a discount retail store in the suburbs. The golden child who once sneered at my career was now spending her days folding cheap sweaters for minimum wage, forced to finally experience the actual hard work she had spent her entire life desperately trying to avoid. But the most devastating fall belonged to Clarice. The shadow lender Blackwood Financial did not grant extensions or accept apologies. They executed the legal foreclosure with ruthless, terrifying speed. The beautiful brick colonial house with the manicured lawn and the heated swimming pool was seized and auctioned off to the highest commercial bidder. Stripped of her primary status symbol, Clarice was forced to pack whatever meager belongings she had left into cardboard boxes and move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the grimy outskirts of the city. The woman who had proudly directed the church choir and held court over the congregation was now completely isolated. She was simply too ashamed to ever show her face at Sunday service again, fully aware that the people she had tried to impress were the very people her golden son-in-law had tried to absolutely destroy. She had built her entire identity on social standing, and without it, she became a ghost in her own life. I did not attend the sentencing. I did not drive past the discount store where my sister worked, and I never once visited that cramped apartment. I simply let the silence settle over my life, a profound and beautiful quiet that can only be achieved when you finally sever the toxic roots of your past. On a warm, breezy Friday evening, I walked out onto the expansive master balcony of my Buckhead mansion. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and burning gold. Below me, the pristine infinity pool reflected the dying light, and beyond the manicured edges of my 8-acre estate, the glittering skyline of Atlanta stretched out toward the horizon. The city was alive with millions of people, millions of stories, and millions of ambitions. But up here, high above the noise and the chaos, there was only pure serenity. I walked over to the sleek outdoor bar and picked up a crystal flute. I popped the cork on a fresh bottle of vintage champagne, the soft hiss blending perfectly with the gentle rustling of the wind through the ancient oak trees. I poured the golden liquid, watching the bubbles rise to the surface, catching the last rays of the setting sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I searched my heart for any trace of guilt, any lingering sadness for the family I had left behind in the wreckage of their own making. I found absolutely none. There was no grief for the mother who had weaponized her love. There was no pity for the sister who had mocked my journey. There was no regret for the brother-in-law who had tried to steal my future. Leaning against the cool glass railing, looking out over the empire I had built with my own hands, I felt a deep, unwavering peace. They spent my life underestimating my intelligence, belittling my drive, and forcing me into a tiny mold of mediocrity. They thought their brutal rejection would break me. They had no idea it was the exact catalyst I needed to become truly untouchable. I raised my glass to the fading light, to the boundless future ahead, and to the absolute undeniable power of a woman who finally realized her own worth.